everybody's trajectory and radicalization process seems to be individualized, but that the sticky glue that holds the transition from being a adherent to one who is willing to or does in fact try to kill is the ideology.
That is the secret of propaganda. Those who are to be persuaded by it should be completely immersed in the ideas of a propaganda, without ever noticing that they are being immersed in it. You may have recognized this quote from Hitler's master of propaganda, Joseph Goebbels. These principles continue to guide the master propagandists of hate of our time, but they no longer serve the Third Reich, but this new totalitarian force that is violent Islamism and Jihadism. At times vicious, at times more insidious, this propaganda has taken the world by storm. From the execution of American hostages in their orange suits, to the pictures of the dreamland Caliphate where worthy men and women could raise a family in a true Islamic country, this messaging has driven a wedge all across European societies, leading Europeans to assassinate fellow citizens in Paris, Manchester, Brussels, and Vienna. With ISIS propagandists paid on average 7 times more than the jihadists risking their lives on the battlefront, we thought we had to take this issue seriously. So, how do jihad's propagandists think? Who do they target? How do they exploit our weaknesses and get the support of useful idiots along the way? To answer those tricky questions, we have with us 2 fantastic guests. One has interviewed hundreds of French jihadis, while the other is a former Al-Qaeda recruiter. But before we go on, if you like the pod, don't forget you can really help it grow with little things like subscribing, rating, reviewing, or even better, sharing the pod with a friend. Now, on to the show. To tackle this question of Islamist and Jihadist propaganda, we are very lucky to have with us Hugo Micheron and Jesse Morton. Hugo, you're a professor at Princeton University in the Department of Near Eastern Studies, and you have earned in 2018 a PhD at l'École Normale Supérieure in Paris. You published in 2020 a fascinating new book entitled Le Jihadisme français, quartier, Syrie, prison, which translates into French jihadism, neighborhoods, Syria, prisons, which includes hundreds of interviews of jihadists and provides a fantastic geology and map of the jihadist movement in France. It also includes a fantastic preface from our friend of the show, Gilles Capel, who came on the show for episode 4 called France's Islamist Poison, and I highly recommend you give it a listen. It's very, very much complementary to what we're doing today. And Jesse, it's a bit of a strange introduction because you have some extent 2 lives on this issue. Your first life, you were a former jihadi propagandist. You're the founder of the Inspire Propaganda magazine, which ended up inspiring many other magazines of that sort, like the Beak of the Islamic State. And after being sentenced to 11 years in prison back in 2012, you became an FBI informant first in prison, and you have since devoted your life to fight against the ideology you once belonged to. And you were founder and head of Parallel Networks, an organization combating hate and extremism. And you're also one of Foreign Policy's 2017 Global Thinkers. Let's dive right into it. Right today in France, I don't want to speculate too much. Well, we're recording this episode on Friday, and on Friday, the 23rd of April, there has been a knife attack against a French policewoman, and she was killed on the spot by someone who looks to be a terrorist, a jihadist terrorist. Jesse, what kind of steps and processes led you and leads the people you knew to become a jihadi or a violent Islamist activist? And how does propaganda fit into that process?
Well, I think that it is very important to say that what we do know, having studied radicalization now for at least 20 years in the post-war on terror era, is that everybody's trajectory and radicalization process seems to be individualized, but that the sticky glue that holds the transition from being a adherent to one who is willing to or does in fact try to kill is the ideology, and that the real power of the ideology to fuse one's needs and lacking sense of significance, belonging, and purpose to a group that allows the group identity to overcome individual rationality is in due part and largely a result of the powerful propaganda that jihadists have been able to utilize. We do see some emulation of that in the far right these days, but it is a very simple fact that jihadists have been very agile and adaptive in regard to conveying their message and their ideas and continuing to motivate attacks by justifying them through the ideology and the propaganda that they utilize. So today's example is particularly interesting. Again, we don't have much details, but if in fact that is the case, then it is one of 270 people at least that have been murdered in France by jihadists since 2015, and that's a particularly flabbergasting number when you put that alongside of the fact that 1,000+ people have also been wounded in jihadist-related attacks. The processes that are associated with radicalization are individualized, but there are similar trajectories. And what we see is, I think, and it taps into a little bit of the conversation that we'll probably hold here today, is a sentiment expressed by Olivier Roy, who's a competent French scholar, who said that it's not so much about the radicalization of Islam as it is the Islamization of radicalism. Meaning that Islam has the Salafi jihadist interpretation of Islam has become a very appealing ideology for those that are frustrated, but has crafted a narrative that is appealing because it taps into this predominant and ever-growing sentiment of self-hatred, I think, in the West, in some senses, of an inability to look at the world with nuance and to see the responsibility for all plight and all pain and all of injustice as a result of the history of European and Western colonialism. There is a very limited ability to see any good, and the propaganda, the way that the narrative is formulated and the way that it taps into people that feel like their needs, their meaning, their need for significance, their need for purpose, their need for community is not being met, is a very appealable sort of, if you can just destroy what is at fault for your plight, namely Western civilization, then in fact you will be able to build up something and contribute to a cause that connects the individual actions of people that could have mental health complications, trauma in their background, and that might be for all intents and purposes the reason that they were susceptible. But the meaning and the significance and the powerful narrative that can give meaning to a person in killing, that gives them a justification for their very existence, has become quite phenomenal. And that is a result of not concentrating on the objective of building a Islamic state per se, but first and foremost, cementing a vision in the mentality of Muslims around the world, and particularly in the West, that they are under attack, that they are coming for your identity, that they are actually waging a war against Islam. And we talk about the French context. That is something that is very apparent with regard to the way that jihadist propagandists target the Western sort of identity in general, but particularly in France, there's this sentiment that France is waging a war against the niqab, France is waging a war against the Islamic identity, and you are under threat. And the only way to address that threat is through violence if you're the Salafi jihadist. But it's not that different than Islamists who might not necessarily advocate or justify terrorism as a tactic, but seek the same objectives and the same goals of sort of creating this sort of discomfort, this sort of lack of trust, and this sort of black and white idealistic thinking that can propel a person into hating everything that is Western identity and constructing an identity that gives them meaning and significance and purpose around this whole notion that by destroying what exists now, you will be building a utopic, better world tomorrow. And that can be very appealing for a person who's engaged in a social movement, the likes of which Islamism in general can be considered, and then begins to see themselves as a soldier for the cause. And so that's what propaganda basically does. It takes a person in a state of threat, feeling that they're under attack, feeling that their way of life, quote unquote, that most typically they didn't even practice up until a very near point of their life before they depart and engage in an act of attempted violence. It's putting people in states of uncertainty and fear that they are under threat. And we mastered it back in my day, and it has only grown more powerful since then. And in fact, now in the near future, it will be very easy for jihadists to proclaim a victory as we prepare in the United States to leave Afghanistan, Iraq, and other ambits of conflict associated with war on terror in the very near future. And so basically, the idea is that the West is oppressing you. They are waging a war against Islam, even though they aren't outwardly proclaiming it. And you can find meaning here. And the most important way and substantive way you can find meaning is to kill in the name of this ideology, if that makes sense.
So, Hugo, there's a lot to unpack here. Maybe before you react to everything Jesse said, one thing I want to talk a little bit about was the debate which your former professor, and my former professor actually, Gilles Kepel, had with Olivier Roy between the Islamicization of radicality and the radicalization of Islam, which was the thesis which Kepel defended. Where do you stand on this? And if you have any thoughts on what Jesse said afterwards?
I think we need to move beyond that debate, especially since, actually what Roy says about jihadism can be true, but for a limited extent of the jihadist phenomenon. For instance, I mean, based on my field work, on my experience, I've noticed that people who were having no link, no relation at all with Islamist movement, in like prior to their involvement in jihadist circle, were very few. I mean, most of them had a sort of a history of activism within Islamist movement. And I think Jesse find the right balance here, because he mentioned the importance of the ideology, the importance of religious indoctrination, but in the meantime, he also mentioned all the backgrounds that can affect and that can give force and set in motion the propaganda of jihadists towards young Muslims in Europe, which is, of course, that of marginalization, be it economic or socially or even culturally. But if we are only looking at that, I think we're missing the point. One of the main factors that is not addressed at all between that debate is that there is a geography of European jihadism. What I mean by that is that if you look at all the European fighters who joined ISIS between 2012, I mean, the jihadists in Syria between 2012 and 2018, what you will discover is that almost 90% of them comes from only 7 European countries. If you look into these countries, you will find the same pattern. That's it. That you have, certain neighborhoods, certain hubs, certain clusters that are more affected, that provided almost the entire amount of jihadi fighters in Syria from Europe. So that's very important, because it means we need to dive into these territories and understand what happened in these territories, what kind of transformation these territories faced in the past 2 decades, and what you will discover is that these places are not do not share a same socioeconomic pattern. You've got among these towns, be it in France, in the UK, or in Germany, you've got places that are super marginalized, economically speaking, such as the French banlieue or the British inner cities. But you also have, in the meantime, some working class neighborhoods where you don't have any troubles there. So the point they all share, though, is that they have a common history when it comes to Islamist movement. You can trace back to the 1990s, the implementation and settlement of jihadi militant or Salafi movement that started preaching in this neighborhood, and at some point, built up some hubs, some sort of preaching like machine that spread the word of Salafism, of jihadism among small numbers of Islamist militants, but these among in the past 2 decades have started to develop and spread their words to the extent that when ISIS raised in the shape of a so-called caliphate, it was able to attract 6,000 European. So we need to look at that geographic dimension. And I will stop on this, but you have also to bear in mind that even though there is a clear European pattern of jihadism, it also fits a more broader pattern because, I mean, current work on the way in for instance, at Oxford, there is now a researcher working on this, and he shows actually quite of the same that I'm just described for Europe, but for the entire MENA region, Middle East and North Africa region. So I think that's very important to look at these territories, to look at what happened there, and to be able to retrace all these dynamics, in the global picture and within the frame of the European transformation of the post-Cold War era, basically.
Jesse, I'm going to ask you to tell us how, when you were in charge of doing that propaganda, how you would think. You co-founded Inspire, which was one of the leading propaganda magazines. You were very much active in those networks. You met a lot of very famous propagandists. How did you think? How do they think nowadays? And I'm going to talk a little bit about one example, which is what happened last month in the UK at a grammar school in Batley, where a school teacher showed in his class, as part of a normal class curriculum, a cartoon of Mohammed by Charlie Hebdo. He was suspended following protests by the local Muslim religious figures and activists. He's now in hiding, and he's fearing he could meet the same fate as the French professor Samuel Paty. You wrote in The Spectator, playing victim and portraying ourselves as heroes was something we knew was without nuance, manipulative, and would likely have deadly consequences. Such efforts supplement the victimhood discourse that feeds radicalization and creates us versus them tropes to provoke would-be terrorists. How would you think, with these kind of events, how would you think about them and how would you exploit them? Jesse?
So yes, essentially as a propagandist, and there is a very serious distinction between those that promote the ideas and those that act violently in the name of them. And there is a degree of disingenuity in the way that you analyze events inside of yourself versus the way that you portray them as a propagandist in public. So inside of myself, I could see nuances with regard to an array of grievances that were promoted. However, that's not the objective when you're dealing with violent extremist milieus. The objective is to put people in a very black and white world. And the way that you do that through the ideology of Islam is you talk about haqq and you talk about batil. Haqq, the truth, a single sole objective truth, and batil, meaning falsehood. But then you can cement that idea with regard to referencing the Quran, for example, when Allah says in the Quran that He is talking about truth, it is singular, and dhulimat, oppressions, is plural. And so what you do is you say, you see, there's only one truth, and that's the truth that we're on. And the Prophet said that the Muslim Ummah was split up into 72 or 73 sects in the end of times, just like the Jews or the Christians, but only one of them is upon the truth. And so what you're doing is you're framing a general macro narrative that suggests that it's not sufficient to just be a Muslim. That in order to be a true actual Muslim in a day and age when the Muslims are weak, then you have to understand that even though it might go against the basic tenets of our religion to kill civilians, this is what is necessary and this is what is justified. Once that is established, you look at every single contextual circumstance, every single political, cultural, and social event, and you frame it in a way that is affiliated to the portrayal that Islam is under attack. That really these people aren't just trying to uphold a way of life that has proven to be successful, that of individual freedom, individual choice, and religion, that in actuality, underneath it all is a deliberate, careful manipulation and conspiracy to destroy Islam as it was given to the true Muslims in the 7th century. And the entire ideology revolves around this ability to maintain consistent talking points that are associated with radicalization and justification for violence, but at the end of the day, to be able to tweak those with socio-political, economic, contextual conversations that can show that this applies under every single condition. So I could have made a conversation about why sneakers in the West or shoes in the West sold for X amount of dollars because it was part and parcel of a war in Islam. That's just something off the top of my head. Or why they produce certain foods because it's part and parcel of trying to destroy the Muslims. Everything becomes about this idea that you are under attack and you are under threat. And that means that in any way, shape, or form, whether you're a terrorist or you're just a sort of a radical Islamist that does the same thing, you're constantly looking to scapegoat because there's this empowerment that's associated with we are victims, but in the same manner that David battled against Goliath, if you're courageous enough to actually practice your religion the way that it is prescribed for you, then you will stand up to this so-called injustice. And that's very empowering. And that's really the basic framework. So it doesn't matter what the circumstances are. A person who is a propagandist can turn every conversation that is trending in the news into one that boils down into a very simplistic framework. That is, Islam is under attack. Everybody hates real Muslims. They'll only like you if you imitate them and behave like them. Therefore, you need to destroy them so that they can no longer engage in their assault against Islam. And that means that it's not about you as an individual, that you're actually acting out in the name of your community. And so you feel invigorated and emboldened by that. And so the media can take on different formats. It could be podcasting. It could be magazines, like you mentioned. It could be, but the important thing of the propagandist is to have outputs enough that you can create echo chambers that can implant people that are susceptible and are not that rational. And you're speaking to them in black and white worldviews, very conducive to their radicalization into violence. You're not exactly telling them that they should go out and commit violence, but what you do realize you are doing is you are creating a very us versus them binary that has no room for grays in between black and whites. And that's very dangerous, particularly when you talk about things that are associated with like traumatic mindsets and people that are thinking in the parts of the brain that are affiliated with fight, flight, freeze responses. And those are the people that you're typically recruiting. So our contention was not that we were brainwashing the susceptible to commit violent acts, but that we were making the truth accessible to those that seek it. The only problem is the only people that are irrational enough to accept it or to view things that way tend to be those with severe psychological issues, criminal histories. I mean, these correlatory variables associated with those that do go on to become violent extremists are significant. And so it's the worldview that is tapping into a person's pre-existent hatred, but giving them a reason to display and to put forth that hatred in a way where they feel like they're doing it for a just cause and they're doing it to defend their group. And that is very powerful when the apt and capable propagandist knows how to correlate current affairs to the religious nomenclature that's associated with fundamentalist Islam. And that doesn't matter if you're the Muslim Brotherhood, Hizb ut-Tahrir, or other sort of less violent extremist movements, or if you're Al-Qaeda or ISIS.
Yes, sure. Thank you very much. It's very interesting. I think what is very important here is to understand that at the end of the day, there is a worldview. I mean, the Islamists or jihadists, they organize things along the line of a worldview that is sort of opposing to a Western worldview, and that is very important because it means that the debate is also on the field of the values. That is very important. You have to bear in mind that a jihadi, whatever his age, he thinks he's or she thinks as well, because since ISIS we've got more and more female involved in jihadism as well, that they are on the right side of history and that the West is not. And that's very important because that's what also is very powerful, is that they feel they are a minority fighting against a majority that is like lying and evolving in the wrong, and that's very powerful as well, because in order to shape an identity and then to sort of produce new behaviors based on this, you need to have a sort of a meta narrative, a ground narrative, as we say in French, un grand récit, which will then, sort of engulf everything that will happen in the news. And then you've got, and that's also what JC mentioned, then you have the translators, those who are able to watch the news, to listen to a political speech, to look at a new law that is just passed at the parliament, and to translate that into the codes and the language of that new worldview. And this is what propagandists are. That's what they do. Is like they use this content and they produce it. And for instance, I was really struck when I was in detention and conducting interviews there with returned jihadists from Syria and Iraq, and they were all French jihadists. That you have some, among them you've got some of them were like super agile when it comes to understand the reality of French society, what is going through, what's French society is thinking about, jihadism and the attacks and the likes, and they are also super agile when it comes to they have all their bearings in the field of the jihadi thoughts, and that's very important because of that, they sort of this hybridity, they are able to translate one into the other. So they are able to look at events in front and translate that into jihadi thoughts and vice versa. So that is very important to understand that. I mean, I don't want to be too long here, but there is also one principle that is very important, and it is the principle of al-wala'a wal-bara'a in Arabic, which could be translated as those of the domain of, or the abode of pledge and the abode of disavowal, and that's again this binary us versus them view, where you need to sort of vow allegiance and pledge allegiance to the believers with the big B, with a capital B, and you need to disavow the rest of the unbelievers. And this is like could be manipulated and shaped in so many ways that at the end of the day, you are able to produce. They are performative speech. You can produce. You can push someone who's just into that ideology into violence or not, based on the interpretation you gave of these principles. So again, this is a complex thought. Is not like crazy people who just like produce some nonsense in their circles. They are like people who are using Islamic principle, and make something out of this in a certain way, which basically is the definition of activism, right?
Sure. And thank you so much, Hugo, for bringing up the specific context of France. It is a context we were meaning to invite into the conversation, and Jesse perhaps can kind of take us into a broader global context as we go about this. But one thing that I was really interested in hearing from Jesse earlier is that there's this idea that there is no single path to radicalization, right? That this is really an individual journey that individuals go through, and that the contingencies that come into play and that propaganda networks prey upon are socioeconomic, they're cultural, but they're experienced individually, and that's what makes them so dangerous in this process of radicalization, right? Is that these networks offer a promise of, as you said earlier, Jesse, meaning and belonging, right? And that's what makes them so powerful. But I wonder if that shouldn't come, whether it's coming at the expense of a broader understanding of how these two prongs are interacting, right? We're seeing how radicalization is, the breeding ground for radicalization is extending into spheres of public life where we didn't see it. In say 5 to 10 years past. And in the specific context that Hugo brings up, there's this whole debate going on now in Hugo's home country, France, where we're seeing these ecosystems of civil society organizations that are pushing this very strong message of communities of faith feeling stereotyped or feeling victimized by mainstream discourse. And I wonder, how do you assess the interaction of the two? Are you concerned at all? We'll start with Jesse, and then we'll turn back to Hugo. Obviously, Hugo's been looking at France for many years now. But Jesse, we were discussing off the record yesterday about the particular context of France, where it seems to be very clear in your mind that these organizations are using that deliberately. They're really kind of evolving along parallel tracks. And so how do you assess the specific context in France? Maybe you want to bring up the UK as well, but are you concerned that these civil society organizations are essentially becoming the breeding ground of radicalization, just to be blunt?
Well, yeah, I mean, I do. We would call them in the literature gateway organizations, and there has been some notion of a conveyor belt between Islamist organizations and more jihadist organizations with a limited amount of empirical data on it, but it is a simple fact that there is a bleed through where someone's first contact with the Islamist message is what opens them up to the politicization of their religion and finding an identity in something that has not a spiritual objective, but much more a political one. And if we look at the long history of Islam's growth in the West, particularly in Europe, and France included, but European wide, the legacy of these civil society organizations that have gained a large role in the social service sector in particular goes back to groups like the Muslim Brotherhood. Who clearly were an anti imperialist movement that had a lot of tendencies that I would say run very congruent with far leftist interpretations of reality from an epistemological and an ontological basis. And they have largely manipulated that to find an awkward alliance between far leftist critiques of capitalism and of democracy as is practiced in Western countries and a very serious social constructivism that does not necessarily uphold any value of truth and objectivity. And that definitely does not ring true for Islamist organizations, but because of the growing frustration, I think, amongst the left in the West, and their ability to sort of denounce any real pragmatic and practical understanding of objectivity as holding any value, and instead to turn inward and to critique all of what is internal to Western societies and Western nations. That the Islamist sectors of society that have gone back to, it would really start it with the current era and the way that the philosophers in France interpreted the Iranian Revolution, where it was supposed to be this new sort of third wave of sort of a synthesis between leftist communism or socialism and right wing or right aligned notions of individual liberty and freedom under a humanist lens. And in actuality, nothing could be further from the truth. So there's this idea that what is being advocated for from amongst these innocuous civil society organizations that have clear leanings towards the establishment of Islamist systems and the Islamization of their communities and in turn their nations, whether they are Western or back in the Muslim world, there has been this very awkward ability for them to tap into the grievances against the state, which have come to define far leftism, particularly in the post-war Cold War era. When it really wasn't possible to point towards communism as a solution and instead to maintain a Marxist grievance against what was relatively successful in spreading democracy and individual freedom, as you will, but to find the faults in it. And Islamists have strategically positioned themselves well to the degree where, though they hold objectivity in their own epistemological and ontological worldview, far distant from the social constructivism that drives the left, they have aligned themselves with regard to the grievance. In the need and the primary objective of being able to destroy Western civilization, quote unquote, and capitalism and all of its sort of faulty underpinnings that they point to. And it's very awkward because it makes it possible for someone to at once be providing civil society organizational efforts to address concerns that for the Muslim community might be very important and not at the top of a list of concerns. So their number one list is not terrorism. Their number one list might be the advocacy for rights and justice as they understand it, or mental health treatment, or to engage in culturally sensitive educational curriculums. But in turn, if you peel that apart more deeply, it has led to a merger with two groups that are diametrically opposed with regard to the way that they see, for example, religion and the role that it should play in the world, but united in the sense that they want to destroy the system that exists. And as Thomas Sowell, the great conservative intellectual, has put it, it's a very much a difference between having an unconstrained and a constrained vision. And so they have this unconstrained vision where they will build a utopia. They just won't tell you what it looks like, right? So they'll tell you that it's the Islamic State and it's the Caliphate if they are on the Islamist level of thinking, even while they're feeding you and giving charity to the poor. And on the far left, they'll tell you about a wonderful position that would be held if you could just destroy capitalism, but they won't give you any concrete or any evidence for the type of society that they want to build, nor do they have to. Because it is the idealism in and of itself that justifies the grievance, and that in turn justifies all of the efforts in a nihilistic manner of trying to tear down the world that exists now in the hopes that you will build one up that's more conducive to your own interests. And in fact, I mean interests, because it really is a sort of narcissistic sort of seeking oneself through activism that comes out when you get underneath it. So when you meet these imams that are, aligned in this manner and doing all of this great CSO work in the field, you really quickly ascertain that really what this is about is turning the faces in the direction of someone who wants to be an ideologue, who wants to be known as a liberator. And there's a fundamental distinction between someone that helps another for the sake of helping another and one who helps another for the sake of being looked at as a helper. And so, unfortunately, what we do have is we have a very serious ability to not understand the implications for this. And we're trekking further and further into an abyss where this awkward unity between what is perceived to be humanistically driven leftist critiques conducted largely on the ground by civil society organizations, that Islamist organizations have tapped into that and are benefiting from it, and also facilitating that divide that can lead one to take the next leap, which is, well, I see through this guy. He wants me to turn my face on him, this imam. I've stayed around long enough to know that this is a scam, but the jihadists are offering me something that is truly utopic and truly idyllic. And so they're setting seeds that for a low base rate of those that are engaging with these sort of precursory, sort of pre-radicalization into violent extremist elements can indeed facilitate susceptibility to accepting the jihadist message.
So, Hugo, in France, we would call this Islamo-gauchisme, and there's been a major controversy around this. What do you think of the semantics or of the word itself, and more importantly, what do you think of the concept behind it?
Yes, I'm not fond of the word in itself. I think it's divisive. I think it creates more frustration, and it's difficult to have a proper debate afterwards. So, for instance, I never use it. I regret that the minister of research used it, and I think before that there was a sort of an open debate about jihadism in France for about a year or so, and after that it completely blurred the message. Aside of that, I think that we are having a problem, not only in France, but actually in the West in general, in Europe and in the US as well, when it comes to debating and discussing about the root cause of jihadism. I mean, when we want to do that, we're facing sort of two sort of behavior and reactions. The first one is like full denial mode. It's like, no, nothing happened. And if that happened, it's because of socioeconomic marginalization. And if we are not unjust, then we will not have this kind of attacks and people doing this. And for instance, this is a kind of explanation that you will see increasingly liberals newspapers addressing, for instance, jihadism in France as a sort of a byproduct of French exclusive secularism, also called laïcité. It's one of the approach that makes it difficult to actually try to objectify what's happening when it comes to jihadism. The other sort of behavior and response you have is like a full hysterization, which is like basically throwing oil on the inflammable debate about Islam in Europe. And I think that also is super wrong, and that it leads to nowhere. What we are trying to do, what we are lacking like massively, and actually what is a shame is that we're having trouble objectifying the trends because we're lacking knowledge about it. I mean, we are lacking the understanding of what's Islamism, what's jihadism, what these groups, what these kind of organization that we see in the Levant or in Afghanistan, what are they doing, and we need to do that in relations with the change that are happening in the past 30 years in the West, and especially in multicultural societies that we have now in Western Europe or in the US. And I think that if we are not looking, at the crossroad of these different dynamics, I think we are overlooking one of the important aspects. So for me, we need not to overlook what's happening within Islam as well, because there is a tremendous change that happened in the past 50 years or so within Islam as well. One being, in the so-called Salafi revolution that happened, which is an ideological revolution that happened within Islam in the past 30 years, and that have consequences over Islam in Europe too. If we're overlooking that, if we are turning a blind eye on that, we should not be surprised if then there is a catastrophe out of this. So I think the full denial mode, which is actually most of the time motivated by ignorance or by a fear of being labeled as racist, actually produce the hysterization. And I'm thinking that, and I think that if we remain into this denial, then we will end up with the far right in power everywhere in Europe. And I think that's also the trap that the jihadis are setting up for Europe. And now France as a country is sort of the prime example of the country that is, bashed constantly for its politics. Whereas in the meantime, we are not the only one facing jihadism in the West. We were, of course, the first provider of jihadists to the Levant. But again, I mean, if you look on a per capita basis, Belgium, Switzerland, the Netherlands, and even Sweden provided way more jihadists in Syria and Iraq than France. So, and we should not also forget that the first jihadi cells were built in the UK, in the so-called Londonistan in the 1990s, and that Brussels was already a place for organizing jihadi attacks everywhere in Europe in the late 1990s. We should not overlook these trends, and we should understand what happened within, Europe in the past since the fall of the Berlin Wall when it comes to Islam in the first place, when it comes to, of course, socially marginalized area, and of course when it comes to the political debate about all of this. And so far it's like if there is a big discrepancy in people's mind between what is religion and what is politics, and we have trouble in thinking a phenomenon that is right at the crossroad of political life and religious life. And I think we should absolutely put an emphasis of studying and understanding better religious politically led dynamic.
Let's talk a little bit about what we do next, and especially I want to talk a little bit about your profile, Jesse. What do we do with people who have ended up joining these jihadist cells? What do you make of the concept of de-radicalization? How do you take them out? And most importantly, how did you leave this ideology in the first place? What kind of steps and processes led you from being a chief propagandist to being where you are nowadays?
Well, I'm again, if the processes associated with radicalization are individualized and unique to everyone, then to a degree that's true for de-radicalization as well. And it's a very important point to start with to suggest that clearly everyone will not de-radicalize. The ideology is potent. And unless we can provide a alternative sense of meaning, significance, purpose, network, narrative, and all of the other things that they are experiencing from their identity that they got from engagement with the jihadist milieu, then there won't be an ability. We tend to think of de-radicalization and radicalization as an individual process, largely with individual agency. But in fact, people's behavior is much more prone to go in the way of their group dynamics and the context in which it exists than it is to be influenced by a rational set of decision making. And that really was my ability to pull myself out of the movement. So I was a very prominent preacher and propagandist, created not just the templates, but was known as one of the, in the English language, most prominent preachers and advocates of the jihadist ideology operating out of New York City. But I threatened the writers of South Park and caused international controversy. For many years, we walked the fine line of not violating the principle of free expression in the United States, which is very liberal compared to anywhere else in the world, and very difficult to cross, in fact. But I knew that when we threatened the writers of South Park on our website that I had broken the law. And it wasn't by desire. It was by the simple fact of not wanting to go to prison that led me to get on an airplane and travel to Morocco to try to get away with what I thought would probably be my incarceration if I stayed in America. But haphazard circumstance took me into a position where the context changed and my contact with the network was almost impossible. So when I arrived in Morocco, it was approaching Ramadan. And because I was on the run, facing criminal prosecution, perhaps, I had to withdraw from the movement. I couldn't talk to Abdullah Faisal in Jamaica any longer, Omar Bakri Muhammad in the UK, and Jim Chowdhury, and all of these charismatic preachers that were constantly keeping me solidified and engaged with this network. I couldn't get the exhilaration of producing propaganda. And so while it was not my intention, what I realized in retrospect that did for me was it pulled me out of the network. When we talk about people in prison settings, there's implications for that. Just to mention them briefly, is that oftentimes we do engagement work in one-on-one settings, in prison settings with people, and then they go right back to a cell block where they're completely exposed to a network that is conducive to their radicalization. So just to mention that, it's important to get people removed from the network, because when people are by themselves, they think very differently than they do when they're with their group. And for me, unbeknownst to me, this induced an ability for me to get back into a level of seeing the grays between the blacks and the whites. And then I did Ramadan in Morocco. And Ramadan in Morocco is very beautiful and it's very hospitable and there's a lot of community there. And there's a very moderate interpretation of Islam that is predominant. And for I think the first time in a while, I had time because my propaganda efforts took up, 80 hours a week when you combine them with work and school and all the other things I had going on. I never took a break. I was constantly, in order to numb underlying traumas and pain, I realize now, working on advocating for this ideology. Being that I had more time, I got to actually sit down and experience the recitation of Quran and to recognize a more peaceful aspect of the religion that I claimed to believe in so much. And then the Arab Spring broke out. And in the context of momentum for democracy in the Middle East, I began to be enthralled by Arab millennial youth, sitting with those that were the most affluent, teaching them GMAT, GRE tests so that they could go back to a West that I despised to study for master's degrees. I started to talk to them about their ambitions in the context of an Arab Spring. And I found myself enthralled. I found myself sort of connecting with new people and having a lot of hope that ran coincident to, like, we always wanted revolution in the Middle East, but recognizing the futility of the totalitarian approach of forcing it upon people from a top down vis-a-vis a bottom up approach. There was a lot of hope for bottom up transformation. And in so doing, I think a second seed of change was planted inside of me. So much so that when Osama bin Laden released a piece of propaganda denouncing global warming and saying that it was all the United States' fault, and really reducing the global warming narrative in a pathetic effort to rebrand Al-Qaeda, for the first time, someone who I upheld as 8 feet tall became a normal human being. And in fact, with a master's degree from an Ivy League school by the time this occurred, it was just absurd that this man who I thought could be a potential leader and policymaker in a future ambitious Islamic state was quite moronic, to be honest with you. But had I been in the network, I never would have realized that. And the process from there just kept unfolding to the point where I spent a year in Morocco, was arrested, finally, with an indictment issued for my extradition back to the United States 2 weeks after Osama bin Laden was killed. And rather than, I could have been tough and I was facing life in prison and I could have pretended that I hadn't changed during that year in Morocco. But rather than do that, I was helped by the fact that I met Mohammed Fizazi, who was a Salafi Jihadist preacher who had de-radicalized in Moroccan prison while I was in prison. Conversations with him made me realize that even though I might end up spending the rest of my life in prison, I needed to at least try to heal, that I was wrong. And it took a while. But by the time I got back to the United States to face possible life's imprisonment, the seeds of change had already been planted. And then the lengthier story, that would be disengagement. In the literature, we distinguish between disengaging from the movement and de-radicalizing, meaning transforming your worldview. The de-radicalization aspect in transforming my worldview took many years, but it became a process of a thirst for recognizing my wrongs, but also recognizing a new alternative ideology and identity to believe in. And it's there that I came to understand the distinguishment between the idealistic utopias that radicals often espouse, but hardly ever live up to the standards that they espouse publicly in private. So I knew there was inconsistencies between the idealisms I was promoting and the practices that I was engaged in behind closed doors, and coming to a more nuanced understanding of the way the actual world really works. And luckily for me, it was not the end of my life. And I have been able to come home from prison and continue to de-radicalize through the work I do, working to de-radicalize others. So without elaborating upon how that my process has some implications for mechanisms and methods that we might utilize to de-radicalize others, I'll end there and kick it back over to you.
Thanks a lot, Jesse. It's a very incredible story. It's very inspiring. Hugo, I know for a fact you're not very comfortable with the concept of de-radicalization. If de-radicalization is not the right tool to fight against jihadist propaganda, what kind of counter-narrative do you think we should build, given the experience you've also accumulated?
Yes, I'm not comfortable with de-radicalization because actually I'm not comfortable with the concept of radicalization either. I mean, I think that we can put everything and its converse inside this, and therefore it's not the right one to grasp reality. I know what's jihadism, I know what's political activism, religious activism, but radicalization, it covers so many different aspects of the phenomenon that at the end of the day, we find it hard to know what actually is the definition of radicalization. And that's actually why it is so widely used by media and the administration and institution that loves, this sort of catchwords. Exactly. So when it comes to de-radicalization, what I want to say is that, of course, every situation is different. And I mean, what Jesse just addressed is fascinating and enlightening. I also think it's not that common, and that's all. I mean, you understand. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but you understand from Jesse's story how difficult it should have been. What the kind of stuff he should have been through to now being able to be so articulated about it, and therefore, not everyone is able to do so. And what I want to say is that for someone who is involved in such a movement, getting de-radicalized is as distant and as absurd as a lay person, a normal citizen, to get radicalized. To think about just going in Syria and just start participating to jihad for the average British or the average French or the average American, it sounds a bit odd, right? And it's because again they perceive or they perceive themselves as being on the right side of history, right? And so we need to work first thing first. We need to put a strong diagnosis of what we are facing right now, and I think we're still lacking, like a global diagnosis explaining what's jihadism in the West. I mean, I'm a researcher. I work on a daily basis on these issues, and I'm concerned about the small amount of intellectual production when it comes to that. Whereas the role of university in a society is actually to produce knowledge, right? And we're still at a moment where we're missing. I mean, like a sort of a common understanding of these issues. Second, we need to be able to talk about this, to make society, to talk about this as democracies, and being able to tackle that challenge without feeling afraid of being labeled as racist, or on the other hand, using this to sort of start stigmatizing Muslims. That's something I mean, we still have to find that balance in the public debate, and we're still far from it. And to be honest, I'm pretty sure we're getting actually in the other way, which is like increasing polarization and politicization of these issues. And last but not least, we need to also understand what's happening, that most of these trends that we've talking about are happening on an individual basis, but also on a local basis. And this might be actually the weak point, especially in Europe, because now we've got, sort of a different level. There is a sort of an ability to talk about that and even to look for answers and response. But on a local level, you've got the sort of the political logic of things, where the mayor at some point needs to be elected, and he needs to deal with association and organization, and that's where the problem lies most of the time. It's like in the small sort of reluctancy or small compromise that at the end of the day will end up creating a difficult situation to deal with. So I genuinely think we need to understand better what's Islam in Europe, to make a big difference between what's Islam and Islamism, but in the meantime to understand what kind of stuff and what kind of activism and activities Islamist organization of all sorts try to develop within Islam. And if we don't open that black box, if we turn a blind eye, I mean, we will have again new surprise. So we need to do more. We need to do more. We need to create more stuff about it. But let's not fall into like simplistic solutions such as de-radicalization center and that's it, I think. And by the time we will have 1 million of JC Morton, I think the problem will solve by itself.
Well, thanks, Hugo. You've got a academic knack for conclusions, because it's a great way to place to end that. Thank you so much, Jesse. Thank you so much, Hugo, for this fascinating conversation on propaganda, jihadist propaganda, how it works, its objectives, its allies, and thank you so much for coming on the show. And see you next week.
And so Jesse Morton of Parallel Networks and Hugo Micheron of Princeton have just departed the room. Francois, what did you think of this episode on jihad propaganda and all the questions we've been discussing?
First of all, it was really interesting to have Jesse on board. It's not often you manage to get someone who really has been in the inside of this whole thing. You really can't get any closer to the kind of nuclear reactor of propaganda than he was. He co-founded Inspire, which was one of the leading magazines. He was an Al-Qaeda recruiter. So tremendously thankful he was able to come here and explain his experience and his road to Damascus moments in Morocco. Something else I want to talk a little bit about. We didn't have that much time to delve into the details of Hugo's book on France and jihadism. His book is so good. I really recommend it to anyone who wants to get an insight on the kind of Islamist jihadist movement in France, but more generally on the way this kind of propaganda works. And there was a really great passage towards the end on prisons. And he says the people who are sentenced to prison, those jihadists who are sentenced to prison in France, really see this as kind of a finishing school for jihadism. They see this as an opportunity to spend 5, 10, 15 years, depending on how long the sentence is, to focus on getting smarter, stronger, and for when they come out. Not just physically, but intellectually. It is so impressive. It's terrifying, actually, when he describes what they do in prison. They're going to read books, but not just, Islamist theology. They'll be reading political philosophy. They'll be reading books about the economy, books about politics, books about law, books about all these kind of very, he compares it to the INA being the top finishing school for civil servants in France, which is very prestigious. And that's actually quite terrifying. And it makes us, the de-radicalization approach, which was pursued in France a few years ago with the idea that, you could pet kittens and all of a sudden they would become nice people and, abandon violence seem to be very short-sighted. These people have a long-term project, and it's quite terrifying.
Sure, and one of the first things that I find really striking in what you just quoted from Hugo is the idea that a lot of these networks have kind of smartened up and really woken up to the power of ideas and the ways that they can kind of embed themselves in the marketplace of ideas and use the freedoms that we enjoy in the West as a vector to further radicalize, the kinds of target populations the kinds of populations they do target in the West. And the other thing that I find really striking in just the quote you just used is we tend to think of prisons as rather the inverse, right? As an experience of what you call de-radicalization. I believe towards the end of the episode when you were asking them both kind of about this concept of de-radicalization. I mean, what comes to mind is the experience of someone who you could almost see as a mirror image of Jesse Morton on the UK. On our side of the Atlantic, who is Majid Nawaz, right? He underwent a thorough process of de-radicalization whilst being in prison in Egypt, I believe. I forget kind of what specific network he was a part of, if it was Al-Qaeda or which one. But he de-radicalized in prison. And I think that the standard understanding in the West, the kind of the popular narrative, holds prisons as being rather the opposite, right? As a very... as just a place where, I mean, the whole concept of imprisoning jihadists seems to be wired towards de-radicalizing them, and it seems like we're failing at doing that if some of them are in fact traveling the inverse route towards more radicalization, towards using the time and the quiet. The quiet, right, and the sort of the peace of mind in a way that comes with being, behind bars, to further radicalize by, reading and kind of smartening up, as we initially said. So, and what I found really striking just before we went live discussing things with Jesse was, I believe just a couple of weeks ago, it was certainly this month, I think it was midway through the month of April, we got the news that the Quilliam Foundation, which is a really interesting organization working on much of the same kind of issue portfolio that Parallel Networks works on, the issues of kind of radicalization and hate and extremism, looking at both the way they manifest on the jihadist space, but also on the far right space, and kind of bringing the two together. So this was an organization that had worked on these issues in the UK, and they had a shutdown in April for reasons that I don't quite remember. But Jesse was talking about it just before we went live, and it seems like there's a lot of overlap in between what they did and what Jesse does and with Parallel Networks. So that's really interesting. And I wonder if you did read bits of Hugo's book. Was there anything particularly French that struck you in terms of what Hugo describes? And in terms of prisons being, it seems like he did a very thorough, on the ground, kind of scholarly work interviewing radicals, right? And what was that like specifically in France? Is there anything you can tell our audience in terms of, well, this is how, specific French prisons operate?
Well, yeah. I think what's specific about France is there's an overpopulation in prisons. That makes it a huge dilemma, because on one side, you would like to isolate those jihadists, but it's not possible. So then you have a dilemma between separating them, then risking the spread of this ideology to non-jihadist cellmates, or concentrating them, and then they kind of end up in a self-reinforcing bubble. And my kind of dilemma is especially strong in France. But I think what is specific to France in his book is the French jihadists have a sense that France, more than any other European country, is a symbol, a beacon for something larger than just the issue of France. So here's this great quote I have from Hugo's book of a jihadist called Youssef who's in prison and talks to Hugo. And he says, "France is a factory of ideas. In France, ideas go very far away from laïcité to vivre ensemble being the capacity of different communities to be able to coalesce together in one community. These are ideas that France has spread to the world, and I believe that it is on this field that we can win." And I think this sense that fighting these battles in France will shape the way these battles are fought across the world is so insightful. And so when we talk a little bit about the kind of useful idiots who mostly, of course, are unwillingly, have been allies, objective allies of these movements by making France this horrendous racist country, which is borderline like Nazi Germany in 1933. They've been doing a huge disservice because, as they say, the reason they target France is because they really see in France what Hugo says is that the values of the French Republic are the total opposite to their utopia. And so they believe that it's important to sap the French model entirely, and that will impact the Western thinking in its whole. And I think that's something we have to be very careful when we make this criticism about France. And there's some genuine criticism about the way the government has been handling some of these issues in debates, but I think a lot of people ignore the fact they are helping this kind of jihadist propaganda, this victimhood narrative that we talked with Jesse.
And that's where this whole conversation comes back full circle, and it seems to interact with the state of French culture at this particular time, where we're again talking of Islamo-gauchisme, and we're talking about the kind of the intersection, or the ways in which some of these woke tendencies towards racializing minorities and victimizing minorities as being the sort of
Trojan horses.
Yeah. So the I mean, this isn't really all that different from what you see in the UK, but what you're seeing in France, my reading is you're having these communities, particularly communities of Islamic faith, that are getting this very strong message from the NGOs that operate in that space, that they are the victims of a system that stereotypes them as being a fifth column, that that doesn't embrace the values of France and things of that nature. So what they perhaps do or don't realize, but it's certainly what they do play into, is that radical networks are using that climate to stoke resentment, right? And what I found so interesting is that there's kind of this larger point, as you said towards the beginning, about kind of the state of liberal democracy, right? I mean, these radical networks are very cunning and acute in the way they analyze liberal society, right? They say, that here's a bunch of Western liberal societies that grandstand around the principles of tolerance and openness. But they don't want you to steer too far away from their script. And if you become an Islamic scholar who's got somewhat of a conservative interpretation of the Quran, that's when you start veering off script, and that's when you start being stereotyped as being a fifth column in French society. So they're using these narratives, and they're the way that the radical propaganda and the woke culture intersect. I mean, we even had a piece on this. Remember, Francois, a few months ago, and the way the woke Islamist axis is lining up is, I think, a really worrying trend and phenomenon, and it's one that we were able to get into in this episode.
So I don't want to go through the whole piece, but essentially the reason we wrote this piece is because I remember Erdogan was complaining about a cartoon in Charlie Hebdo, and what was so funny is this cartoon, where he was talking about systemic racism and all this kind of buzzwords, sounded like something you would read on an American campus complaining about systemic racism. It was just so incredibly similar that we had to write something about it. But anyways, I highly recommend you all go and get a read of Hugo's book, Le Djihadisme Français, Quartier, Syrie, Prison. A translation will be coming soon. You can also listen to our episode number 4 with Gilles Kepel, France's Islamist poison, on this very issue, one of the most popular episodes. And speaking of popular episodes, Jorge, do you know how many countries we have downloaded so far after 8 months, 6 months, 7 months? How many countries do you think we've been downloaded in?
Look, I have no idea, but I'm tempted to number the Islamic State as part of that number.
Actually, we have downloads in Iraq. That's a good point.
Okay.
But we have downloads in 71 countries, so fantastic. Thank you so much. Our newest country edition is Mozambique. So if you're currently listening to us from Cidade de Maputo, thank you very much. And if you want to support us, our idea would want to reach 100 countries by the end of the year. Wouldn't that be fantastic? There's so many small things you can do. You can like the show, you can subscribe, you can review. We always love your reviews. You can rate, you can send it to friends. All these small things really help the show grow week after week. So anyways, thank you so much for support. And if you can always lend a little hand, feel free to do so. Jorge, thank you very much. Thank you, Hugo. Thank you, Jesse. And see you next week.
See you next week.